Hello, and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering Commander deck profile video. Today, I'm going to be taking a look at one of my oldest and still one of my most favorite decks that I have ever made. This is Melek Izzet Paragon. So yeah, this is of course my Spell Slinger and combo deck, and also a showcase of my favorite Izzet, that is of course blue-red, my favorite Izzet spells in the entire game. Whenever I find a cool Izzet spell, I really try my best to fit it into this deck somehow. So yes, let's just move this deck out of the way and then we'll get started. First of all, let's take a look at the commander. This is Melek. 6 mana. Melek is not a cheap commander to play. A 2/4, I mean, 4 toughness isn't nothing, but really, combat ability is nothing to write home about. But what Melek does is you play with the top card of your library revealed, and you can cast instants and sorceries from the top of your library. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery from your library, you copy it, and you can choose new targets for the copy. So really, all Melek is going to do is sit in play and allow you to cast your instant and sorcery spells from the top of your library, and then you get to copy them. And of course, that allows you to do all sorts of shenanigans, just getting extra copies of your spells for free. It's not a bad ability to have, but Melek is not one of the more recent legendary creatures. We can put it mildly that way. So Melek is also not like the more recent commanders in that he doesn't, carry your entire deck for you. And at 6 mana, if it gets taken out once or twice, then yeah, you're kind of not going to be playing him more than that. So really, the deck can function without Melek in play. Melek just makes things a whole lot easier. So keep that in mind. Now, obviously, Melek wants to cast spells. So let's take a look at all the spells, all the instant and sorcery spells, that is, all of those spells in the deck first. So we're gonna look at some card draw or tutor effects in this pile. So Mystical Tutor is one of the few direct tutoring effects. You search your library for an instant or sorcery, reveal it, put it on top of your library. So normally, it is instant speed, mind you. You can do this on your opponent's end step to get something for your turn, but typically, this is maybe not the best kind of direct tutor, but for Melek, it is perfect because the top of your library is exactly where you want those cards to be. So that's why we've got Mystical Tutor. Sometimes you can just win off of whatever you search for. We also have Brainstorm. Yes, of course, this is a commander deck, right? So there's 100 cards and only one of any given card, except for basic lands. I should, point that out in case you're unfamiliar with the format. So Brainstorm here, 1 mana instant, draw 3 cards, put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. It's a very efficient draw spell at 1 mana, and again, you can put spells that are in your hand and wasting space on top of your library so that you can either shuffle them away by other means or cast them with Melek to copy them. Useful. Brain Surge is the new bigger Brainstorm, 3 mana, except you draw 4 cards, and then put 2 from your hand on top of your library in any order. So the same idea here, very useful to have though. Drawing 4 is nice. Frantic Search. Now this is a very powerful effect that is, in a way, a bit of a win condition sometimes. 3 mana, you draw 2, you discard 2, but then you untap up to 3 lands. So if you copy this, then you're untapping 6 lands, right? And if you can keep copying this, somehow you can keep untapping lands and keep on casting spells, and you're drawing all the time. So yes, this is a very potent effect to have in this deck. Jeska's Will, again, this is just a really good card, and the value you get off of it just keeps on going if you're copying it somehow. Choose one ability, that's 3 mana. Choose one ability, and if you control your commander as you cast this spell, then you choose both. You either add red for each card in target opponent's hand, or you exile the top 3 cards of your library and you can play them this turn. So you can get a lot of mana and a lot of cards for only 3 mana. Inspired Tinkering is similar. 5 mana's getting up there, but you exile the top 3 cards of your library and you can play them until the end of your next turn. You also create 3 treasure tokens. So yeah, this is... Again, 5 mana's a lot, but I really like this card, and if you can copy it, those 3 treasures become 6, or 9, or more, who knows? Pore Over the Pages is kind of like a bigger, slower version of Frantic Search, but I think it just goes to show how powerful that effect is in this deck, that I would still use it. Mind you, it's still a very good card, either way. 5 mana sorcery, draw 3, untap 2 lands, or up to 2, then discard a card. So, again, you're just drawing cards and untapping your lands so that you can continue playing stuff. And here we have Practical Research, 5 mana instant, draw 4, discard 2 unless you discard an instant or sorcery. So, this one, well, and the next card, Thought Flare, which is exactly the same, except you always just discard 2. These cards are more recent additions to the deck. I'm not sold on them. I think they're cool. Like, drawing 4 cards always feels good, and if you can copy these, drawing 8 cards feels real good. But 5 mana is a bit steep for that effect. Still, they are instant speed, so you can hold your mana for other things. So I don't think they're bad. Maybe there are other effects, though. If you're running a similar deck and you want to use smaller draw spells that draw fewer than 4 cards, then, you know, you can go ahead and do that. It's certainly not a bad thing. And what would a blue deck be without Counterspells? And, well, you'll notice something interesting about all the Counterspells in this deck. And, well, I'll talk about it a bit later on when I go over some gameplay of this deck. So let's see if you can spot the theme. We're starting with Supreme Will, a 3 mana counter target spell unless its controller pays 3, which typically is just counter target spell. But there's another mode to it. You can look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 1 into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. Those are both useful abilities to have. Likewise with Confounding Riddle, which is a very similar card. Look at the top 4 cards of your library, though. It digs a bit deeper. Put 1 into your hand, the rest into your graveyard, which could be better, or counter target spell unless its controller pays 4 mana. So Confounding Riddle and Supreme Will, very similar effects, but they're good to have and certainly help you keep your stuff safe from whatever your opponent's doing. Moving along, we have the Archmage's Charm at triple blue mana. Not the easiest card to play sometimes, but, you know. You either counter target spell, target player draws 2 cards, or you gain control of a non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. This does a lot of things. One possible mode is a counter spell. We also have Insidious Will at 4 mana. Which does a lot of things. You counter target spell, or you can choose new targets for target spell, or you can copy target instant or sorcery and choose new targets for it. So it is sometimes kind of fun to let an opponent's spell resolve, but take a copy of it for yourself because of the, you know, whatever juicy effects you might get from it. And then we have the Cryptic Command. Again, this one's 4 mana. And you choose 2. Counter target spell, return a permanent to its owner's hand, tap all creatures your opponents control, or draw a card. Lots of modal abilities here, one of which is counter target spell. Gotta have those counter spells. We have the Mystic Confluence at 5 mana. Yeah, these are getting expensive. But powerful abilities nonetheless. You choose 3 abilities, and you can choose the same one more than once. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 3, return a creature to its owner's hand, or draw a card. So sometimes you just counter a spell unless its controller pays 3 and draw 2 cards. Or just draw 3 cards. You can do a lot of stuff with this. And finally, we have the Sublime Epiphany at 6 mana. Yeah, this one's a lot, but it does so many things. Choose one or more. Counter a spell, counter an activated or triggered ability, return a non-land permanent to its owner's hand, create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, or target player draws a card. Lots of stuff, all very relevant abilities, and yeah, one of these is technically a counterspell in addition to all this other stuff. But we aren't out of spells yet. Oh no! What would a red deck be without some burn spells? And some of these are definitely the cards that I designed this deck specifically to use. You'll be seeing some cool stuff in here. So Geist Blast is the first one. 3 mana instant, does 2 damage to target creature or player, which is not great, but for 3 mana, a 2 and a blue, you can exile it from your graveyard to copy an instant or sorcery you control. So this is a bizarre card, and nobody uses it anywhere, but I think it is really cool, and I love that second ability that can activate from the graveyard of all places. So yeah, this is certainly one of my favorites, very interesting. We also have the Prismari command at 3 mana. Choose 2. It deals 2 damage to any target, or target player draws 2, discards 2, or target player creates a treasure token, or you destroy an artifact. Does a lot of stuff. 2 damage to any target, though. There's the burn effect for this pile. Cerebral Vortex. This is another weird card, but I like it. 3 mana, target player draws 2 cards, then this does damage to that player equal to the number of cards they have drawn this turn. So you can use it for yourself as like an instant speed Sign in Blood, right? Just draw 2 cards, take 2 damage at instant speed on an opponent's turn. That's actually not even bad. Or, if one of your opponents is going off, you can just use this to deal some obscene amount of damage to them. That is funny too. But yeah, that is Cerebral Vortex. Ral's Outburst. 4 mana, instant speed, 3 damage to any target. Look at the top 2 cards of your library, put 1 into your hand, the other into your graveyard. Now that's another thing that I like to have in this deck, because of course I plan to copy all of these, or at least potentially copy all of these. I like to have extra effects stapled onto them, so being able to get extra cards in addition to doing damage is a nice bonus to have. Ill-Timed Explosion here is a sorcery. You draw 2 cards, 4 mana, and then you can discard 2 cards, and if you do, it does X damage to each creature, where X is the greatest mana value among cards that you discarded this way. So this is sort of a board wipe, otherwise it's just draw a couple cards. Still cool to have damage and card draw all rolled into one. Oh, and here's another favorite of mine, Turn and Burn! Yeah, this is the good stuff. So this is one of the fuse spells from Dragon's Maze. Turn makes target creature lose all abilities and become a 0/1 red weird until end of turn. And Burn is 2 mana, does 2 damage to target creature or player. So if you really don't like a creature that your opponent has, you can just spend 5 mana, turn it into a 0/1, and then burn it. That works. Or, if your opponent is attacking you, sometimes you can 2-for-1 them by turning an attacking creature into a 0/1 and then burning something else for 2 mana. This is a weird, versatile spell, but again, I like it. This is the kind of wild effect that I really go for in this deck. And then we have a classic Prophetic Bolt, 5 mana instant, 4 damage to any target, and you look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 1 into your hand, the rest on the bottom. So similar to, what was it, Ral's Outburst, just does some damage and gets you a card out of the deal as well. And finally, we have Blast of Genius at 6 mana, another Prophetic Bolt sort of effect. You choose target creature or player, you draw 3 cards, discard a card, and this does damage equal to that discarded card's mana value to that target creature or player. So drawing 3 cards is nice, and it can do a bunch of damage. 6 mana is pretty steep. But don't worry, I've also built a lot of the deck to compensate around that. But wait, there's still even more removal! Oh yes! What would a red deck be without Vandal Blast? 1 mana, destroy an artifact you don't control, but you can overload it for 5 to destroy all artifacts you don't control. Very popular card, and for good reason. It's very good. We also have the Chaos Warp classic red card right here. The owner of target permanent shuffles it into their library, then reveals the top card. If it's a permanent, they put it onto the battlefield, but it gets rid of any target permanent, right? This is a very potent removal spell. 3 mana instant. We have Fiery Confluence. Well, you choose 3, sort of like the Mystic Confluence before, and you can choose the same mode more than once. 1 damage to each creature, 2 damage to each opponent, or destroy target artifact. So you just do whatever makes the most sense at the time. Baral's Expertise. This is another great card to copy. 5 mana. You return up to 3 target artifacts or creatures to their owner's hand, but then you can cast a card with mana value 4 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. So you also get something free out of it, always good, and if you copy this, you get more free stuff as well as getting rid of more of your opponent's cards. Crush of Tentacles. This is my main method of wiping the board in this deck. 6 mana, you return all non-land permanents to their owner's hand, but if its surge cost was paid, its surge cost is 5, and you can only play it for that cost if you cast another spell this turn, then you also get an 8/8 blue octopus after that has happened. So, yeah, my playgroup has decided that Cyclonic Rift is just too much of an unfun card to play against. So we've kind of just stopped using it, and I've started using Crush of Tentacles instead, because it is, well, it's much more fun, and it gives me an excuse to use my 8/8 blue octopus token. And finally, we've got another one of these double cards. Commit, 4 mana instant, put a target spell or non-land permanent into its owner's library, second from the top. Again, this gets rid of a lot of stuff. Don't underestimate target non-land permanent removal. And Memory, which has to be cast from the graveyard. It is an Aftermath card, but each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into the library and draws 7 cards. A useful ability to have on demand from the graveyard, especially when you have such a powerful removal spell attached to it. So Melek does a pretty good job of copying instants and sorceries on his own, but I have a handful of other spells that do that as well. So starting with Expansion and Explosion here. Expansion is a 2 mana instant. You copy an instant or sorcery with mana cost 4 or less. Simple as that. This can target your opponent's spells. It's not only your own, so again, sometimes you can just get some free stuff out of that. And Explosion is a big... Really, this is kind of a finisher. It deals X damage to any target, and target player draws X cards. So this gets you cards and deals damage to an opponent, ideally. We also have Return the Favor. So this is a one of these spree cards, so you have to choose 1 or more additional costs as you play this. It's worth 2 plus 1 to copy an instant spell, a sorcery spell, an activated ability, a triggered ability, and you can choose new targets for the copy. Or another 1 is you change the target of target spell or ability with a single target. So this is good protection for your commander or whatever else you might have, or it just copies something. Very good. Reiterate, though, this is the big one. 3 mana, copy an instant or sorcery, you can choose new targets, but it has buyback 3, which means you can pay that additional 3 as you play the spell, and if you do, you put it back into your hand as it resolves, which means you can play it again. Very, very useful card. And finally, one more of these Aftermath effects. We have Refuse, which is 4 mana. It does damage to target spell's controller equal to its converted mana cost. That's not the better ability, but from the graveyard, you can copy target instant or sorcery and choose new targets. Sort of like Geist Blast, actually. This is worth 3 mana to do. Just another pocket copy spell that you can keep stashed in your graveyard until it becomes relevant. And what is all of this building to? What are we trying to do in this deck, you might be asking? Well, here are the payoffs. We have Turnabout. 4 mana, you choose Artifact, Creature, or Land. And then you tap all untapped permanents of that chosen type that target player controls, or untap all tapped permanents of that type that player controls. So this is how you generate obscene amounts of mana to do other things, and I will go over that in the gameplay section of this video in a little bit. And also we have Epic Experiment. 2 mana, 1 red, 1 blue, and X. You exile the top X cards of your library, and for each instant and sorcery card with converted mana cost X or less among them, you can cast it without paying its mana cost, and then you put all cards exiled this way that weren't cast into your graveyard. So, I have designed the entire deck to work with Epic Experiment. The entire point, really, well, one of the entire points of what you're trying to do is just to put a bunch of mana into this, and you could even copy it, honestly, and just get 2 Epic Experiments for a huge amount of mana, and just cast all sorts of things for free. Sometimes it is a total whiff, sometimes it can win you the game, but in any event it is going to be a fun time. Epic Experiment is such a fun card, and that is why, well, that's why it's in the deck, right? Who would have thought that I'd put my favorite spells into my deck of favorite spells? Okay, so we are finally through with the instants and sorceries. So let's get into the creatures. Yes, there are creatures in this deck, of course. And, well, we're gonna take a look at the pile of cost reducers right here, like Goblin Electromancer, the classic. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, so all those big things that are worth 5 or 6, well, now they're worth 4 or 5, or what have you. 2 mana to play, it's a 2/2, but yeah, the stats don't matter that much. Stormcatch Mentor, yeah, this one isn't foil, because at the time of recording this, the special dark foil version of this card hasn't been released yet, so one day this will be in foil, but for now this is my placeholder. 2 mana, 1/1, it has haste, it has prowess, it's a very power-crept version of Goblin Electromancer, but instant and sorcery spells cost 1 less to cast, and that is that's the important part. Thunderclap Drake, another 2 mana. This one has flying, which might be relevant, but your instants and sorceries cost 1 less, and you can sacrifice it for 3 mana. When you cast your next instant or sorcery spell, copy it for each time you've cast your commander from the command zone this game. Another cool copying ability just sort of tacked on there, but I'll take it. I always appreciate the help. Brawl, Chief of Compliance, 2 mana, your instants and sorceries, guess what, they cost 1 less. And whenever a spell or ability you control counters a spell, you can draw a card and discard a card. That is an often forgotten ability, but it is there, so, you know, that is relevant sometimes, always nice to have extra draw. And the Haughty Djinn is my final of these cost reducers. 3 mana, it's a bit bigger, but its power is equal to the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard, so it can get pretty big, and it does make instants and sorceries 1 less to cast as well. And here's a handful of other creatures that I like to use in my blue decks. They all have the effect where you can tap them to untap another target permanent. This is Vizier of Tumbling Sands, 3 mana, it's a 1/3. It also has cycling for 2 mana, and when you cycle it, you can untap target permanent, so sometimes that's useful, but mostly these are my mana dorks of the deck, because you can untap your mana rocks or your lands to get yourself extra mana. We have the Forensic Researcher here, again, 3 mana, 1/3, just untaps another target permanent you control. You can also collect evidence 3 to tap a creature you don't control, but mostly you're likely just going to be untapping your own stuff. Kelpie Guide is a 3-mana 2/2 that untaps another target permanent you control, or you can tap target permanent only if you control 8 or more lands. Again, you're typically going to be untapping your own stuff. And Fate Stitcher is a 4-mana, this one's a bit bigger, tap or untap another target permanent, so it has both options right there, but it has Unearth for 1 blue mana. That is relevant because if you discard this to whatever, Frantic Search or something, then you can play it for 1 blue mana, for only 1 turn mind you, but it does gain haste, and that can make all of the difference if you've got something big to untap. Now, let's take a look at my Recursion Creatures. These are creatures that will get your instants or sorceries back from the graveyard so you can recycle them. Jace Vryn's Prodigy is a 2-mana 0/2. It taps to draw a card, then discard a card, and if there are 5 or more cards in your graveyard, then you exile it and return it to the battlefield transformed. Yeah, this is one of the flip planeswalkers from Origins, and I guess I should show you the other side, just a second. Here we go. This is always a bit of a pain to do, but Jace does transform into Jace, Telepath Unbound. Comes in at 5/+1, up to 1 target creature gets -2/-0 until your next turn. But -3 is you can cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard this turn, and if it would be put into your graveyard, exile it instead. But still, it's a nice ability to have technically for free, right, if you do this on a different turn than the one that you played Vryn's Prodigy on. And -9, you get an emblem with whenever you cast a spell, target opponent puts the top 5 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. Okay, well, that's unlikely to happen, especially if you're using that -3 right away, but it's there in case you can pull it off. And moving on, we also have the Izzet Chemister. This is a fun one. It has haste, 3 mana, 1/3. For red mana and tap, you can exile an instant or sorcery from your graveyard. And for 2 mana and tap, you sacrifice it to cast any number of cards that you exiled with it without paying their mana cost. So you can cook up a really big storm of instants and sorceries if your opponent just sort of lets this thing live for a while. Otherwise, you can play it and exile something right away, and then maybe use it immediately on your next turn. Still useful to have. I like this card, personally. Here we have the Bloodwater Entity. This is, well, it's kind of like, the Tutor from the beginning, Mystical Tutor, because this one puts a spell, an instant or sorcery, from your graveyard on top of your library, which is right where Melek wants it to be. It also has flying and prowess in case that's relevant. It's a 3-mana 2/2. And then we have the Torrential Gearhulk at 6 mana, but it does have flash. It's a 5/6. When it enters the battlefield, you can cast target instant card from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. And if it would be put into the graveyard, exile it instead. So this kind of gets you access to whatever is in your graveyard, as long as it's an instant. This does itself have flash, so you can hit your opponent with counterspells by using this, and it's nice that you don't have to pay that spell's cost as well. You just have to pay the 6 up front for this thing. And you get a 5/6 out of the deal, which isn't irrelevant sometimes. And finally, we have the 2 creatures that I would sort of consider to be win condition adjacent. We have the Nivix Guildmage, 2 mana 2/2. For 3 mana, you draw a card and discard a card, but for 4 mana, you copy an instant or sorcery you control, and you can choose new targets for the copy. The thing is, you don't need to tap Nivix Guildmage to use these effects, right? As long as you have mana, you can keep on doing this, and that is important to remember. And Dualcaster Mage. 3 mana 2/2, it has flash. When it enters the battlefield, you copy an instant or sorcery, and you can choose new targets for the copy. This, believe it or not, is a combo piece with another card in this deck, and again, when I get around to the gameplay portion of the video, I will show you how it all works. Besides Jace, there is one more Planeswalker in this deck, Teferi, Temporal Archmage. 6 mana. Teferi's worth a lot of mana. But +1, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, the other on the bottom of your library. That's not as important as his -1. Untap up to 4 target permanents. So you can actually generate positive mana by playing Teferi for 6, using his -1 and untapping a bunch of stuff. Very useful, and I mean, if your opponent leaves Teferi in play, then you're just gonna get a whole lot of value on your next turn. And -10, for sake of argument, you get an emblem with, you may activate loyalty abilities of Planeswalkers on any player's turn anytime you could cast an instant, which is pretty good, you know. But mostly that -1 is the reason that Teferi's here. Now let's move on to the artifacts. Of course, there are artifacts, and these first ones aren't my mana rocks, they're just different artifacts that do things. We have Sensei's Divining Top, 1 mana, cheap to play. For 1 mana, you look at the top 3 cards of your library, put them back in any order. So hey, maybe you're putting a instant or sorcery on top for Melek to cast. And you can tap it to draw a card and then put Sensei's Divining Top back on top. So this is just a very useful card to get out early and then start manipulating the top of your library. And then we have the Primal Amulet. 4 mana is kind of steep, but I think it's worth it. Your instant and sorceries cost 1 less to cast, so it is another cost reducer. And whenever you cast one, you put a charge counter on this, and if there are 4 or more charge counters on it, you can remove them and transform it. Yeah, this is another card that transforms. Just a second. It transforms into the Primal Wellspring, which adds a mana of any color, and then when that mana is spent to cast an instant or sorcery, you copy that instant or sorcery for free. So, yeah, it gives you mana and it copies your spells. This is a very potent land if you can play it. Sometimes it's not the easiest thing to transform, but if you can, it is well worth your while. Which brings us to all of the mana rocks. So we start out with the Thought Vessel. 2 mana, taps for colorless, but you have no maximum hand size. Hey, that might be useful. We have Mana Crypt, which is worth 0 mana, but it taps for double colorless. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you flip a coin. If you lose, it does 3 damage to you. But that is a small price to pay for having 2 free mana like this. It is an absurdly powerful card. Sort of like Sol Ring, but what would a commander deck be without Sol Ring? 1 mana, taps for 2. Simple as that. Thran Dynamo. This is a classic commander card from way back. 4 mana, but it taps for 3 colorless mana, which is pretty big for all of those mana-thirsty spells in this deck. Arcane Signet is 2 mana, but you tap for 1 mana in your commander's color identity, so a very efficient mana rock. Same with Talisman of Creativity. 2 mana, it either taps for colorless or for blue or red, but then it does a damage to you. The Izzet Signet here, 2 mana. For 1 mana and tap, it adds both blue and red to your mana pool. So that's a cool way to sort of turn your other colorless effects into colored mana. And the Gilded Lotus. 5 mana, but it taps for 3 mana of any one color. So if you can get this into play with one of those creatures that untaps something, you can be generating a lot of mana off of it. Which finally brings us to the lands. Now, this deck has a number of these flip lands that you can just play as either a spell or as a land that adds mana. Yeah, I'm not gonna bother showing you what the land sides look like because they're just lands that tap for mana, right? Some of them come in untapped if you pay life. Sundering Eruption, though. 3 mana, you can destroy target land. Nice to have land destruction. And its controller can search their library for basic land, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and shuffle. So, you know, they can't be that mad at you, right? And creatures without flying can't block this turn. But yes, you can also play this as a red-producing land. Pinnacle Monk is a creature, 5 mana, it has prowess, but when it enters, you can return an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. Useful ability to have in this sort of deck. Again, you can just play this as a land that makes red. Shatter Skull Smashing, you can play it as a land, or it does X damage divided as you choose among up to 2 target creatures or planeswalkers. And if X is 6 or more, it does twice that much damage instead. So it's nice to have this removal, which would otherwise just be a land, so either way, handy to have. Sink into Stupor is a very good one. You can play this as a blue-producing land, but 3 mana return a spell or non-land permanent to its owner's hand, so it's kind of a pseudo-counterspell or an unsummon effect. Good to have. Silundi Vision. This one, again, can tap for blue. This is the only one that has to enter tapped if you play it as a land. The others you can pay life to make them enter untapped. But 3 mana, look at the top 6 cards of your library, you can reveal an instant or sorcery, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom. So this is it digs pretty deep, like 6 cards is pretty good. And of course you can cast this off of Melek or Epic Experiment or something to just keep on digging for whatever you need. And finally, the Seagate Restoration. For a whopping 7 mana, you draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand plus 1, and then you have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. So it's nice to have that giant card draw spell that, at the beginning of the game, when you can't cast this anyway, you can just play it as a land that taps for blue. And to finish off the deck, we have this heap of lands. There are 31 of them, if you're keeping count. And, well, they're lands, right? Volcanic Island is the old mountain island, taps for both. We've got Steam Events, which is the same, except it enters tapped unless you pay 2 life. Still useful. Cascade Bluffs is the filter land that can turn 1 red or blue into 2, or a combination of both. Sheevan Reef is taps for colorless, or either color and then it does a damage to you. Storm Carved Coast enters tapped unless you control 2 or more other lands, but it taps for both colors. Training Center taps for both colors, and it enters tapped unless you have 2 or more opponents. Fiery Islet, you do have to pay life to use it, but you can sacrifice it to draw a card. Sulphur Falls enters tapped unless you control an island or a mountain, but it taps for both colors. Command Tower just taps for both colors, whatever your commander's color identity is. And Izzet Boilerworks is the bounce land. Comes into play tapped, you have to return a land to your hand when it enters, but it taps for both colors at the same time. It adds 2 mana to your mana pool. So it's still useful to have. Really good to untap these, I should say, with your untapped creatures. We also have the Ancient Tomb here, which taps for double colorless and does 2 damage to you. Gets you ahead in numbers there. The Temple of the False God does the same thing, except you don't take damage, but it doesn't work unless you have 5 or more lands in total, including this one, so 4 other lands. Scalding Tarn is the fetch land, pay a life, search your library for an island or mountain card. They don't have to be basic, you can get your Steam Events or Volcanic Island or whatever, then shuffle your library. Prismatic Vista, this one does just search for a basic, pay a life, search for basic, put it onto the battlefield. It's not tapped, so hey, that's something. And Fabled Passage, you don't have to pay life for this one. Search for basic land, put it into play tapped, and untap it if you have 4 or more lands. So usually that card is coming in untapped. We also have the Thundering Falls here, which is an island mountain. It has those basic land types. It's a good idea to get this off of your fetch land. It enters tapped, but when it enters, you surveil 1. So it's nice to have that top of the library manipulation for Melek. Same with the Temple of Epiphany. Now, in most of my decks, I have upgraded the temples to these surveil lands, but in this one specifically, I kept it around. It enters tapped, but when it enters, you scry 1, which is something that could benefit Melek. Otherwise, it taps for either color. Halimar Depths. Yeah, this one enters tapped, but then you look at the top 3 cards of your library, put them back in any order, it taps for blue. And Castle Vantris enters tapped unless you control an island, so a lot of these can enter tapped. You really have to be careful about when you're playing these lands. But it taps for blue, or for 4 mana and tap, it scries 2. You know, if you've got nothing else to do, you might as well scry, right? Lotus Field. This is another great card to go with your untapped creatures. It has hexproof. It enters tapped. When it enters, you sacrifice 2 lands. Now, those lands don't have to be untapped, mind you, so you can use them first. But this itself taps for 3 mana of any color. Yeah, this can get out of hand pretty fast if you've got a couple of those Vizier of Tumbling Sands effects. Mystic Sanctuary. It is an island, not a basic island, but still an island. It enters tapped unless you have 3 or more other islands, but when it enters untapped, you can put an instant or sorcery from your graveyard on top of your library. Hey, look, another one of those effects that Melek loves so much. Otawara, Soaring City, is the channel land in blue. 4 mana, discard it, return an artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker to its owner's hand. It costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control, so it's nice to have this effect from the hand. It's not technically a spell, right? This is an ability, so it's difficult for your opponent to interact with, and it is extra removal. Boseiju, who shelters all. This is an interesting one. It enters tapped. You have to pay 2 life to use it, to add colorless only. But if that mana is spent on an instant or sorcery, that spell can't be countered. Sometimes that makes all the difference, right? And then we have the basics. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 islands, and 1, 2, 3 mountains. To go with all of the island mountains that we also have in our dual lands. So yeah, nice to still have a few basics on hand, just in case. Really, basics aren't even that bad. I think people don't use enough basics. I certainly don't. I could probably afford to run a couple more, really, but 8 is a decent enough number. You probably aren't going to run out. Alright, so let's take a look at some gameplay. How exactly does this deck win? What are you trying to do? Well, I will show you. The most direct path to victory is by using Turnabout. Now, Turnabout on its own won't win you a lot of games, right? You can untap your lands, maybe get a bit of extra mana in doing so, but if you combine it with Reiterate, then you have a rather nasty combo on your hands. So all you need is the 4 mana to cast Turnabout, and 3 mana plus 3 mana for buyback is another 6 mana, so 10 mana altogether. And as long as you have 7 mana worth of stuff to untap with Turnabout, be it lands or even artifacts or creatures, I suppose, as long as you can generate 7 mana off of Turnabout, that is 1 mana more than you need to cast Reiterate. And then you can keep casting Reiterate, because it always goes back to your hand, and you can keep on generating that 1 extra mana, which will add up to infinity, right? This gives you infinite mana as long as you have enough of a setup to begin with. And this also goes with the cost reducer creatures in the deck, because you can reduce Turnabout and Reiterate. Even the buyback cost is part of the total cost of Reiterate, so you can reduce that as well. Well, not in addition to the mana cost, but if you have, say, a Goblin Electromancer, that will make it 5 mana in total to cast and buy back Reiterate. But in any event, the cost-reducing creatures do make it easier to pull off this combo. And then when you have infinite mana, what do you do with it? Well, you know that you have Reiterate in your hand, right? Because it keeps coming back. Then you can just cast infinite copies of whatever little burn spell you might have. Geist Blast might only do 2 damage, but 2 times infinite copies, because Reiterate is infinite damage, and that is game right there. So it doesn't have to be Geist Blast, of course, it can be anything that does damage. But yes, infinite mana plus Reiterate means you have infinite copies of anything that you might want to do. And we can actually accomplish something very similar with Nivix Guildmage. You see, Nivix Guildmage is a creature, yes, so it's a little more... It's a bit easier for the opponent to deal with in one way or another, but this second ability for 4 mana to copy an instant or sorcery, now that works just as well when combined with Turnabout, maybe even a little bit better. So 4 mana here, 4 mana there, for 8 mana, as long as you can generate 5 off of Turnabout, you are going infinite with the Nivix Guildmage, and infinite mana in this case also means you can draw your entire library and dig for whatever you want, and cast any number of them so that you can win the game. Yes, very good stuff there. And maybe moving aside from Turnabout for a second, Frantic Search has a similar role, or it can anyway. And because you untap those 3 lands, as long as you can generate a lot of mana doing that, maybe because you have an Izzet Boilerworks in play, and or a Lotus Field, or something like that, any lands that can tap for more than a single mana, you will be gaining mana off of Frantic Search. And then you can copy it with Nivix Guildmage, or if you're making a huge amount of mana, I suppose you could even use Reiterate to do this. But either way, you are netting mana by doing this, and therefore you can just keep on going and eventually cast all of your Geist Blasts or whatever. And as a final note here, Jeska's Will sort of does the same thing, except Jeska's Will can only make red mana. So I guess as long as you're using Reiterate and an opponent has a lot of cards in hand, yeah, this one is less likely. I guess Frantic Search isn't all that likely either. These two are less likely to work, but in theory they can still work, and they will get you there if the circumstances arise to use them that way. Now let's talk about Epic Experiment. Oh yes, this is the fun one. Like I said earlier, sometimes it's great. Sometimes it fizzles completely and you accomplish nothing, but that is the whole fun of it. So, in order to play Epic Experiment, first you need to understand how it works, right? So you exile the top X cards of your library, you can cast all the instants and sorceries that have a mana value X or less. That's the easy part. Here's the thing, when you do that, Epic Experiment is still on the stack and resolving. So none of these spells that you cast with Epic Experiment can resolve themselves until Epic Experiment is done. So you cast all of these spells, they all go on the stack, everything else then goes to the graveyard, and then Epic Experiment is finally done, and everything that you exiled can then resolve, because it is now all on the stack. So that means you have a stack that you can interact with. So if you have a Cooperate or something like it in the graveyard, you can use it now to copy whatever spells you just cast for free with Epic Experiment. So while you probably don't want to use reuse off of Epic Experiment and do damage to yourself, that seems silly, you can just send it to the graveyard so that you can use Cooperate to hit something else. Hey, that's good. You have to pay the mana for it, of course. It's not free in this case, but still, it is something that you can do. Now, that is why I have all of these cards that do something in addition to doing other things, so that when you cast them off Epic Experiment, then maybe it's not a total waste. Why am I using Explosion instead of, say, Invoke the Firemind? Well, because Invoke the Firemind is just a big spell with an X cost, and if you cast it off Epic Experiment, then X is 0, and it does nothing. At least Explosion has Expansion stapled to the side, and you can cast Expansion off of Epic Experiment, and it could actually do something. So that's just something that you need to keep in mind as you're building a deck like this. Same with all the Counterspells. Like I said, they have something in common, and that something is that, yeah, they can counter spells, but they also do other things, because flipping a counterspell off of Epic Experiment is useless. It would do nothing. But Confounding Riddle can dig you extra cards out of your deck, or Insidious Will can copy something else that Epic Experiment has already cast. So these cards, while more expensive, maybe, than a 2-mana counterspell of some kind, they are more versatile and therefore far more useful with Epic Experiment in mind. And then, of course, with Epic Experiment, you can just cast whatever you happen to flip off the top of your library, right? All of these things that do damage or draw cards or copy other spells or what have you, it's all just a roll of the dice at this point. What do you get? Who knows? Hopefully it's good. Maybe you'll just happen to get Turnabout and Reiterate. Actually, I guess, speaking of Reiterate, I still have it off to the side here. Reiterate, if you cast it with Epic Experiment, it will not... You won't have to cast it for its mana cost, but you can still pay the buyback cost, which is an additional cost, and therefore you can still pay it even though the mana cost goes to 0, so when it resolves it will still buy back to your hand. So it is technically possible to combo off of a single cast of Epic Experiment. And to make things easier, of course, there's all the cost reducers like Goblin Electromancer. These are very helpful in the general running of the deck, so the more of these that you can get into play, the better, because every one that Epic Experiment costs less is one more card you get to flip over, and it's just that much more fun. And finally, there is one more combo involving Dualcaster Mage. So Dualcaster Mage, of course, it copies something on the stack. It's a very suitable card for this deck. But consider for a moment that you also have Sublime Epiphany. So if you cast Sublime Epiphany, targeting with its create a token that's a copy of target creature you control ability. Targeting whatever, Goblin Electromancer, because I happen to have one on hand. And choose some other mode as well, because you probably want more value out of it than just that. And then you flash in Dualcaster Mage with Sublime Epiphany on the stack. It will copy Sublime Epiphany with all of the same modes chosen. Except now you can change the target of this ability to your Dualcaster Mage, who is now in play. So, your copy of Sublime Epiphany will resolve, it will create another Dualcaster Mage and do whatever else it's doing, and then that other Dualcaster Mage will come into play. Alright, another Dualcaster Mage has come into play, and it can target the original Sublime Epiphany, which is still on the stack. And as you can see, that will just loop forever until you, until you stop copying Dualcaster Mages and making more Sublime Epiphanies. So with this, you can return everything that your opponents control to their hand, and you can draw out your entire deck, right? So hopefully out of that you can somehow cobble together a win. So this is sort of a board state that you should keep in mind as you're playing, and maybe something that you can try to work towards if you are, sitting on this Sublime Epiphany for any length of time. Well, there you have it. That has been my Melek, Izzet Paragon, spell slinger / spell copying commander deck. Yeah, it's a lot of fun, just to cast a bunch of spells and draw a lot of cards and do a lot of damage and eventually try to combo off for some kind of win. Now, this deck isn't... it's not necessarily a slow deck, despite all the large spells in it, but it's not super fast, right? You're not going to be comboing off on turn 4 or 5. maybe if you have some sort of obscene start with all of the mana rocks, maybe you could do something like that, but that is extremely unlikely. Typically, you're going to be waiting for a few turns more than that at least, so that you have enough lands in play to use Turnabout and Reiterate, or to dump a whole bunch of mana into an epic experiment to really make things epic and experimental, I suppose, and maybe throw in a cerebral vortex in there as well for good measure. Yes, just all these super fun spells that I don't see a lot of people using often, so you know what, it's always nice to showcase them in a deck like this. However, this is also going to be the end of this deck profile, and I do hope that you enjoyed it. And if you did, then please leave a like, a comment, subscribe, and I hope that you'll join me again next time for whatever deck I might be profiling next. Till then, ta-ta. Oh, good heavens, look! We got a collector's rare. Excuse me a moment. Oh, hello! I like it, I like it, I do. I was worried for a second that this box was going to be suboptimal. Oh, goodness, that is a pull right there. Let's find out. Oh, boy.